what I'll talk about today is going to include this to some extent, but right now I'm really working on implementer training. And so we've done a couple randomized controlled trials actually to evaluate the efficacy of a computer-based instruction program for imparting the skills to, whether it's a BCBA or an educator, or a paraprofessional or RBT, to implement complex treatment packages like the skill-based treatment package. So the BST literature is very rich with examples of effective training for procedures that include just a handful of components. But intervention packages like this, I mean, we have something like 23 integrity items on the checklist. So training for that needs to look a little bit different. So we're really investigating what kind of asynchronous methods are most impactful on treatment integrity when there are a lot of integrity items for an implementer to worry about. And I will, if there's time, I hope to talk a little bit about what we've learned so far in investigating that.
That would be amazing.
Great. And you just ready for me to go?
Go for it, yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, the real focus today, and thank you so much for having me. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here and talk with you all. It's really cool to have an opportunity to interact with an international audience, especially. So please engage with me in the chat or whatever the means is of asking questions. I'm happy to take them along the way. But also, as I talk, please know that I have a very American point of view. And so there may be times I don't even realize I'm referencing something that is true in the US, but isn't true elsewhere. And I definitely welcome feedback on that. I'm interested in knowing what educational and behavioral service delivery looks like in other places. So don't hesitate to let me know if you have a question about how something I'm saying might apply where you are, because the policies are probably very different. So today I will talk to you about kind of a series of studies on implementing intensive intervention for children in school settings who have dangerous interfering behavior, and specifically the emotional and behavioral disorders population. So I know that the Tizard Center is very focused on intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I'm going to be educating you a little bit about EBD, but there's overlap in those populations, and I don't think there's a whole lot that I might say about EBD that wouldn't apply to other populations. So just, try to generalize, and if you're having trouble thinking about how something could be applied to the population of clients with whom you work, don't hesitate to ask, and I may be able to help facilitate that a little bit. All right, so, before I go further, I do also want to acknowledge the many people, Wanxin got up there by herself, the many people who've contributed to the development of procedures and also collecting of data and analyzing it, of all the stuff I'll share today. So we've had several partnerships, and I just want to identify 3 graduate students who've really helped me pull some aggregate stuff together that's pretty exciting. That's Maggie Chen, Mark Casasa, and Wanxin Wang. All right, so what I will do is just start by orienting you to what I mean by emotional and behavioral disorders, and why their unique characteristics mean it's extra important we investigate how to do good behavioral treatment in school settings, and how their characteristics are matched to certain common procedures in applied behavior analysis. Then that's a nice segue into the next step, which we'll be talking about some of the inherent risks of the intervention procedures we use, and of course, what some of the solutions may be for some of those risks, or at least solutions that are possible and worth pursuing through research and practice. And then I'll get into specific procedures and outcomes. Then if I can, I'll talk a little bit about staff training procedures and outcomes, because, none of this means anything if only researchers or like super highly trained people are delivering intervention in these ways. And then we can wrap up, and I sure hope there's time for questions if you have them at the end and haven't already asked them. Okay, so I'll start out just by getting us on the same page about what I mean by emotional and behavioral disorder. That's a broad term that is inclusive of several other terms that are used as special education eligibility labels in the United States. So there might be an eligibility label, or there is an eligibility label of emotional disturbance, but also a student might identify as, or be identified as eligible for school-based services if they have another label maybe corresponding to their ADHD diagnosis, or even their autism diagnosis. So emotional and behavioral disorders can include a lot. And broadly, it simply refers to patterns of severe and persistent problem behavior that really are the primary impediment to a child's educational progress, and can't be attributed to health, sensory, I believe the definition even says intellectual factors. So we're really thinking about kids who are language abled. They have otherwise apparently typical cognitive skills, but very persistent and severe problem behavior that's preventing them from really accessing the curriculum in school. So it's kind of like we're really tackling the absence of a known cause when we say EBD, but also a pattern of behavior and a profile. So that's not super satisfying, and it has the gray boundaries of this concept cause us some problems in identifying kids and estimating how prevalent this particular profile is in the general population. And it can make it hard to effectively support these students just because we don't always have great criteria for deciding that they're in the pool for access to a certain set of services or not. So it's tricky, but it's also, I'm glad we have this concept, because otherwise there'd be a population of kids we were entirely missing an opportunity to support. Okay, so it's, at this point, the estimated prevalence is about 1 in 5 in the total population, although fewer than 1% of children in US schools access services under the corresponding emotional disturbance label. So, we think this is more prevalent. The prevalence, outstrips the actual access to services. So that's kind of an issue. And just again, children with medical diagnoses such as ADHD, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, others in that vein, as well as autism, may be included in this category. And as I talk through the applications of enhanced choice model of skill-based treatment today, you'll see that participants in our data set have a real variety of labels and diagnoses. So again, it's kind of a catch-all term. But there are some things, as much as the definition is a little blurry, we do understand some things about the conditions under which EBD is likely to emerge. So children with EBD are exposed to lots of risk factors like poverty or economic disadvantage. They experience high levels of family stress due to unemployment, housing issues, domestic abuse, criminality. So they experience a lot. And consider what this means. Poverty, homelessness, domestic violence, these are, they constitute and are correlated with other adverse childhood events or traumatic experiences. So we are talking about a population of kids who are almost defined by their history of trauma, which I think is something that we are more concerned with now as behavior analysts than we ever have been before. And just another reason to really keep that in the forefront as we think about how to develop procedures that not only are effective, but also create a good and healthy experience for the client. Often our clients have experienced significant trauma before we ever see them. Now, EBD also has major impact during and after school age. So those are risk factors that they're experiencing along the way, and they sort of double as long-term outcomes. Children with EBD more likely to have academic skill deficits, drop out of school, be arrested, and they're less likely to have jobs. So it's a little bit of a self-perpetuating cycle, because those things link directly back to criminality, unemployment, homelessness. So we have a generational problem, certainly in the United States, but I imagine this shows up elsewhere as well. And finally, importantly, children with this profile are very unlikely to receive behavioral or other healthcare services relative to other populations of children. I'm just very concerned about them, and that's kind of been the driving force of my work along the way, back when I was a practitioner, and then throughout my doctoral program, and since then as a faculty member and researcher. But all this said, all children, regardless of their backgrounds or their experience, can be accessed and supported, and we can reach them in schools. Now, this is something where my US bias might be coming into play, but in the United States, All children are entitled to what we call a free and appropriate public education. So we really can guarantee that these kids are in school and we can reach them through educational routes. And now I recognize that models for supporting students with disabilities may be very different elsewhere, and it may not be true that you're going to find all of the students who need services and aren't getting them outside of school in school. But many children do access services in school, so we have to figure out how to effectively support development of alternatives to problem behavior in that setting. It's not easy. Schools are complicated. But in the classroom, the behavioral skill deficits of kids with EBD, as well as other disabilities, show up in a couple specific ways. So children with emotional and behavioral disorders have a hard time communicating their wants and needs. It actually has come to light relatively recently in the last decade of research that often these children have language deficits that are unidentified. And those language deficits directly contribute to problem behavior. These students have vocabularies and they speak fluently. So it's easy to miss that there is either a receptive or expressive deficit. And as a result of that, it's pretty well documented at this point that adults, especially teachers, tend to overestimate the language abilities of students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and therefore underestimate the need for communication skill training. Functional communication training isn't as socially valid in schools for populations who are language abled, and so it's harder to get into practice. And I think part of the issue here from the child's standpoint is that really communicating wants and needs, functional communication, could be looked at as including really two different components. One is discriminating that you want something to change. That is very hard for children. And the other is taking action after making that discrimination. And the emotionality that comes with an establishing operation or like a challenging scenario can make it even harder for children to make that discrimination and then appropriately act on it. In addition, very typical classroom events evoke severe problem behavior. So it also doesn't take a whole lot to create that problem of discriminating what I want and then acting in an appropriate way to get that thing. One typical event is, broadly speaking, delayed access to preferred activities. There's lots of research out there showing that impulsivity, kind of the opposite of self-control, and EBD co-occur. These kids have a hard time waiting for the larger, later reward and often select the smaller, sooner reward at the cost of that larger later. And actually, my dissertation was focused in that area. I probably won't get to talk much about that, but it may come up. It was surprisingly relevant to what I'm doing now. Also, denials of requests evoke severe problem behavior and academic work. Recall that I mentioned earlier that learning disabilities and learning problems usually come along for the ride with emotional and behavioral disorders. And there are a couple ways to look at this. Not all of the learning problems are a result of learning disabilities or an ability issue. But if a child has a learning disability and is already pretty prone to problem behavior, the academic challenges they face will be more evocative than a student who doesn't have a behavior disorder facing those same challenging academic demands. And that academic challenge really can increase the value of escape from work for a child who's already gotten into the habit of using problem behavior to escape from work. And as a result of that, behavior problems result in missed instruction, which then makes the work harder in the future and continues to ratchet up the value of escape. This is a really unhealthy cycle, and it's probably just worth taking a minute to unpack. Also, another unhealthy cycle that results from that one is the relationship between the student and the teacher. And Kevin Sutherland and Joe Webby did some really important work in this area, in the 90s and early 2000s. It's longer ago than I realize sometimes, but they documented pretty nicely that in classrooms in the US, children with EBD, when presented with work, will engage in a way that makes it less likely the teacher will present more work to them. So they are punishing instructional behavior on the part of the teacher. And in so doing, the teacher avoids delivering instruction. And so their behavior of instructing is negatively reinforced through avoidance, and that contributes to the student's likelihood of engaging in more punishing behavior. I don't know that I said that as well as I sometimes do, but I think you can picture this. Students and teachers teaching each other how to, and ending up in this situation where the academic expectations are extremely low, which really just perpetuates the learning differences between kids with EBD and learning problems and other populations. So,
Joy, can I
yes.
just jump in there to deliver the first keyword? Okay,
Yes.
guys, the first keyword is emotional. The first keyword is emotional. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Okay, so the good thing is these behavioral skill deficits translate very nicely into some of the skill acquisition targets that are familiar to us as behavior analysts. We're talking about functional communication, tolerating delays to reinforcement, as well as actual vocal or other denials of reinforcement, and cooperation with academic instruction or tolerance for it. How do we get them engaged without emitting behaviors that punish the instructional behavior of the person, the adult in the room? I also think we can look at these. We talked a little bit about impulsivity as something very likely to be a problem for a child with the pattern of behavior we call EBD. And I think these things could be looked at as components of a self-control composite skill. So whereas in my dissertation, I did an intervention study specifically focused on increasing the delays at which children will wait for the larger later reward. Now I'm kind of saying, okay, we need to teach a whole lot more than that if we want children to make appropriate choices, so to speak, across contexts. And I think this is how we do it, or at least how we begin doing that. And it sounds like many of you are going to be familiar with this. Skill-based treatment is an intervention package. It's really nicely matched to the skill targets that I just highlighted. And, there are many efficacies and some effectiveness studies published on skill-based treatment. Most of them included children with intellectual developmental disabilities, autism. That's where most of the focus is. So disadvantaged children with EBD haven't generally been represented. Of course, my paper included some, and then Dittu Rajaraman's original enhanced choice model skill-based treatment paper included some as well, and those were students from our site. But nonetheless, like, even though we're light on literature in this area, it's a good fit, and there's more literature emerging all the time. I guess I can't see a show of hands, darn, but I'm gonna assume some level of familiarity with this process. So I'll try to be brief to save time for data and interpretation later. But the skill-based treatment process begins with functional analysis, and a specific form of functional analysis called the interview-informed synthesized contingency analysis, which follows an interview. And so the interview and the analysis together are currently called practical functional assessment these days. But this starting point is absolutely necessary so that a highly motivating and highly effective contingency can be identified. A contingency that controls problem behavior, meaning when reinforcers are present, there is no problem behavior. When they're absent, we very quickly see signs of escalation that we can ideally interrupt before any severe problem behavior is emitted. So we look very carefully and interview very carefully for precursor, non-dangerous topographies of behavior that belong to the same functional class as dangerous forms of problem behavior. And Christine Warner and colleagues published this really fabulous study in 2020 where they interviewed 10 different sets of caregivers of clients for forms of behavior that co-occur with dangerous problem behavior, and then did an extinction analysis in which they evaluated directly through contingency whether the behaviors identified by caregivers indeed belong to the same functional class as problem behavior, were controlled by the same contingency. And for 9 out of 10 participants, that was the case. So this really increased my confidence in including non-dangerous signs of a coming escalation in the class of responses I reinforce in a functional analysis. In addition, Joshua Jessel and colleagues in 2022 demonstrated that doing this, reinforcing open response classes, ones that were not holding out for hitting, kicking, biting, self-injury, but looking for maybe that aggressive pencil tap or that facial expression, doing that and reinforcing those non-dangerous forms of behavior in analysis means a safer analysis. So there's less dangerous problem behavior when you do that than when you don't. And of course that makes sense. It also tends to keep doing this, reinforcing precursors tends to keep emotional responding to a minimum. And so we don't get that kind of gradual escalation that can occur across a functional analysis process, across sessions, as the child is increasingly stressed, because we interrupt that escalation cycle immediately with reinforcement. So we can assess quickly, safely, and effectively, and so on and so forth. Once we've done that, we proceed to treatment. The first stage is functional communication training, where in 100% of trials, we reinforce some appropriate replacement for problem behavior that serves as a MAND for the same reinforcer we identified in the analysis. Yeah, and usually this should be a novel response. I'm going to assume you guys have been exposed to information like that. Once the functional communicative response has been mastered, then we start denying the MAND about half the time. So about half the time we still reinforce the MAND immediately. Half the time we say no and reinforce some indication that the denial has been accepted. For my clients, that has been just an okay or a cool or even a thumbs up. So this is really quick and simple. And then we just say, hey, nice job accepting that. You can play. It's cool. After the child masters those skills, we start to initiate a demand fading process where we gradually increase the number and complexity of instructions the child needs to cooperate with to access reinforcement. And so in this phase, about 1 out of every 5 trials, or 20%, we still reinforce the communicative response immediately. They ask and we say, nice job asking, yes. And about 1 out of 5 trials, 20% of the time, we say yes, or we deliver reinforcement even after we've said no, and the child accepts it using that trained response. And then the rest of the time, 3 out of 5 trials, 60% of the time, we say no, they say okay, or whatever other means of accepting our denial. We then present some work. And again, over sessions, over time, that work increases in its magnitude and challenge to the student and looks closer and closer to the classroom conditions that evoked problem behavior and got them referred for treatment. So those are the basics of SBT, and there's so much more I want to say, but I'm just going to try to go light on that to create time for other discussion. But feel free to reach out if you want more information about some of the specifics. I will talk a little bit more about specifics in a bit. But just since we're generally talking about SBT and not yet talking about exactly the way I do these things with my clients with EBD, what do you think? Maybe just drop it in the chat, even though I can't see the chat, so maybe don't. But think to yourself, I just talked to you about how we respond to alternative responses during teaching. But how do we respond to problem behavior in a way that accelerates skill acquisition? What do we do? We're reinforcing these alternatives. What happens with problem behavior? You're probably thinking extinction, and that's absolutely right. That it is the most efficient way to facilitate skill acquisition and reduce problem behavior. Doing that, discontinuing reinforcement for problem behavior, putting it on extinction, significantly increases the efficaciousness of our training procedure. And that is not in question. There are good studies demonstrating that. Now, escape extinction is relevant when we're looking at academic or other demands, task demands of some kind, doing chores, whatever it may be, listening to somebody evokes problem behavior. We have to think about, well, how do we keep them from escaping doing this thing? That's a little different than withholding a positive reinforcement. So escape extinction is defined as, preventing problem behavior from terminating an aversive stimulus. And there are a couple of different ways we do this. We can simply continue to verbally and physically present task demands, or we can physically guide clients to comply with task demands. And also, just as a side note, escape is the most commonly identified behavioral function at large in school settings and broadly. So we have to think about this, how we do these procedures all the time, because most clients have a function or their behavior functions as a means to escape something. And again, very common in school settings as well. Escape extinction is actually one of the most common components of a function-based treatment package in schools. There's a Dart and colleagues I cited down here. If you want to look, there's a systematic review of escape interventions, just because that function is so likely. The thing is with this, though, and you probably are anticipating where I'm heading, especially if you read the introduction to my paper, that not Dr. Vasanis, sorry. In my mind, you are Dr. Vasanis, you're there, that he shared with you. The thing with this is that extinction has collateral effects that can be dangerous, and also physical guidance can evoke problem behavior. Crockett and Hagopian published this study a while back, but it really demonstrated clearly that even using a 3-step prompting procedure in which physical guidance was part of the prompt hierarchy evoked problem behavior. And when they dropped out the physical guidance aspect of that prompt, they saw no problem behavior. These tiers in this figure are, so they did a multiple baseline across like sets of tasks that varied by difficulty. So for low difficulty tasks, physical guidance was not evocative. They were able to keep that 3-step prompting procedure in place the whole time with no problem. But as tasks were increased in difficulty, moderate to high, they had to eliminate that. And that just clearly demonstrates that physical guidance itself can actually worsen the problem we're dealing with. So it's escape extinction is matched to the problem and it's effective, no question, but it does have a couple limitations. This effect is idiosyncratic, though. I don't think you should assume that this happens with all clients. Not everybody minds physical guidance. I have 2 toddlers, and I physically guide them sometimes. And sometimes I have to for their own safety because they're running out into a parking lot. So I also don't want anybody to take away from this that I think we should never physically guide clients. My point is that there are costs to it, and we really need to examine each of those costs. So importantly, we will examine some more costs. So physical guidance, guiding a client to maybe even use a picture exchange as a mand in functional communication training is one thing. And physical restraint is another. And so those 2 things shouldn't be conflated. However, in the US in schools, you've probably seen news items like this. Physical guidance can escalate to restraint or isolation very quickly, and it does. It happens all too often, and it has devastating outcomes. So I'm particularly concerned about this issue in schools because I hate to say that if you open the door a little bit to physical guidance, it can get really dangerous, but that does appear to be true, especially because educators just don't have the same behavioral training that someone with a master's degree in behavior analysis has. So it's not a criticism of educators, it's just a product of the contingencies in our environment. Furthermore, several groups have argued that physical management is countertherapeutic for clients who've experienced trauma because of the psychological distress that it can induce in clients. And you may have seen this paper as well. This is a really good one. It's one of the first behavior analytic articles really unpacking what trauma means from a behaviorally, conceptually, systematic standpoint and how we can use that information. Finally, we have to think about the client experience. I think all of us are probably pretty aware of the conversations in communities of people with disabilities these days about the tactics used in applied behavior analysis historically, and we have to think about that. They're dissatisfied at best, the vocal folks in these conversations, and traumatized at worst. And instead of explaining why they shouldn't be, we really need to look at what happened to them and think about what changes we can investigate for their effectiveness so that we can embed more appropriate and more therapeutic procedures into our treatments. So all of this, I've already spent more time on that than I meant to. I always end up talking too much about all that, but I can't overstate the importance of it while I want to be really cautious about overstating any absolutes. Not saying never use physical guidance, but we just have to examine the costs of it and take them into account in our risk-benefit analyses as we select the various components of our treatment package for a specific individual client. Some clients prefer punishment, physical guidance. Greg Hanley in 2005 published a paper demonstrating that. Like, they did an objective assessment of preference among different treatment procedures, and clients preferred punishment in some cases. So again, you got to think about your individual client. But the big takeaway from all this is that we really need to be developing alternatives and supplements to treatment packages that offset some of these risks. And one of those is the enhanced choice model. So Dittu Rajaraman published the initial paper on this. I co-authored that one. But enhanced choice model, just in brief, includes, it was applied to skill-based treatment, but for the record, I think you could insert any teaching procedure right here under practice. So that happens to be SBT in the published studies, but it could be academic instruction, without a functional communication training or demand fading component. But anyway, in the enhanced choice model of skill-based treatment as written up and verified for its effects on client behavior, There's the practice context in which teaching happens. There is a concurrently available non-contingent reinforcement context that we call Hangout, when we talk to kids. That's accessible at any time, contingent on either entering that area, just crossing the boundary, walk away into Hangout, and we will leave you alone and give you your stuff, or mandate. A child could say, I want to hang out, and then we'd stop presenting demands right then. And then a third option that the school-based clients had, and it looked a little different for the clinic clients in the first study, was leaving altogether. That meant when we came to pick a client up for an appointment, they could say no. But we would stay for the duration of the scheduled appointment and check in. Hey, if you want to come, cool. If not, totally fine. It's not going to impact us showing up tomorrow to give you the opportunity again. They could leave and come back. And the whole idea here is that practice is hard. And so inevitably, when we're teaching skills, we see problem behavior when the rubber hits the road and things get challenging. And so essentially what we're doing by programming these concurrently available alternative contexts is programming additional alternative responses to problem behavior. So if you don't want to do the thing we're making you do, you don't have to engage in problem behavior to change your environment. You can do these other things that look a lot like an adult discriminating that they need to walk away and take a break. That's a life skill. So really, really like this model, obviously. The other defining characteristic is there is no physical guidance in the enhanced choice model. And so hangout and leave become very important here, because in practice, we are using an escape extinction procedure. I mentioned one variation for that is just continuously repeating task demands and presenting the work. And that, with no alternative, can still escalate into dangerous behavior, even if we're not physically guiding the client. So there's no physical guidance. We're not going to use physical guidance to keep them safe. And so we really need these alternatives. Just a fun fact, I probably shouldn't take the time on this anecdote, but the reason I ever got involved with enhanced choice was I was working with Ditu. He was teaching us skill-based treatment procedures, and I was actually expecting at that time, and things got really dangerous because we weren't using physical guidance. And so I wasn't going to restrain the client because of the school policy, but also there were just extra considerations. There are lots of staff members based on their health and fitness factors who just can't get beaten up. So I really love the idea of investigating supplements like this. So the initial study was published a couple of years ago. 2 of those participants had EBD. And then, of course, our study came out recently with 3 additional students, and this was really an extension. We did some things that are different, but instead of rehashing those things, I'm going to look at with you quickly here a retrospective, and this is a consecutive controlled case series. Hagopian wrote a nice paper on what that is and how it allows us to look at single case designs. Normally, we can't draw conclusions from those about the probability that a client with similar characteristics will respond to the same treatment demonstrated using a single case design. But if we take a bunch of those in which we use the same procedures, we can start to estimate, and we include everything, even the non-effects, then we can estimate the probability a procedure will have an effect for participants with given characteristics. So got the 5 students from the previous publications, and then there are 4 additional applications that we'll include here.
Joy,
so let me tell you,
before
yes.
you crack on to explain this and unpack it, could I just deliver the second keyword? So the second keyword is risk. The second keyword is risk, as we were talking before about risks and benefits. So the keyword is risk. Thank you.
Alrighty, that was a perfect transition point, because now we're going to get into some procedures and data. So I'm located in an area where there's a very large urban school district, about 90,000 kids. And there's one school that supports the kids with the most intractable problem behavior within the public school district. And that's a K-7 school. And everybody there has an individualized education program, meaning they are eligible for special education services, have a documented disability. Most of them, if not all, have experienced trauma, and they come from poverty. The district uses the classification indigent, which is, in my opinion, a little bit of an outdated word, but what that means is these students are economically disadvantaged. And I go to the principal each year and I say, who are you most concerned about? And that is the kid that we work with in that semester. Sometimes there's more than one, depending on our capacity. So my point here is just that we're really looking for kids who have long histories of their behavior, their problem behavior working really well for them. So these are challenging cases. We also make sure that their problem behavior is evoked by these certain conditions that I highlighted earlier as kind of the hallmarks EBD and things that we can really conveniently contrive in our setting. Sometimes if they say it's all about this one particular peer, I say, okay, let's try to tackle that in a different way than this, because I haven't yet developed procedures for involving peer Confederates in these particular procedures, but that might be a good thing for us to work toward. So there are 9 participants here. I'm just going to show you some figures that summarize the demographic data. Most of them were male. About half were white, half were Black or African American, and they were in elementary school age range 6 to 9 years old. As far as educational labels go, most of them had a formal emotional disturbance label, but then all these other labels show up as well. And again, EBD is a very broad term. We call this a school for children with EBD, but they get there through lots of diagnoses and disability labels. Importantly, there's this link with academic and language deficits. Most of these applications included participants with documented reading and math deficits. It was kind of like it was both or neither, interestingly. Note that it's also very hard to assess the academic skills of kids with problem behavior evoked by presentation of academic demands. So, to the extent that some don't have identified deficits, it might not be that they're not there. It might be that they weren't able to be assessed. Same goes for language impairment. So about a third of these kids, a little more than that, have a documented language impairment. Some did not, conclusively did not, and for others it was unknown. Like there was a note in Kendrick's file that said we couldn't assess it. So we'll come back to this table later, but that's just the same data you saw. The dangerous problem behavior that prompted referral included these forms. So this is just like the number of clients for whom, each of these forms of behavior showed up in the interview. And we looked for non-dangerous precursor topographies. As I said, here are some examples, just in case you need to know what that looks like. Sometimes it's like a specific description of what he does with his hands, contracting fingers into the claw shape and shaking. It only counts if it's both. But this is a really helpful thing to ask lots of questions about in the interview. Then we take that interview data, make a hypothesis about the contingency that will evoke or what the EO that will evoke problem behavior. And then, the flip side of that is the reinforcer, reinstate that thing that you just withdrew. Does it shut it down? If so, we have what we need to teach a skill. So we interview specifically for what does attention look like? What do tangibles look like? What does escape look like if you're trying to calm a child down? And that's how we get our synthesized reinforcer. Importantly, compliance with the child's MANs is something we ask about. Does it matter if you do what he says? And that's often kind of rolled into our high quality attention. And this looks really different across kids. So it may seem generic because it's true that for each of these clients, it's not always going to be true that attention, tangibles, and escape are all relevant. They were for all of these individuals, but the forms of attention look different. Some kids liked more mothering. Some kids, literally, I had a client complain to me about one of my graduate students who was implementing recently. They were playing basketball. Oh no, it was football. He's a real big football player. And my students have to learn about American football and the rules and get into this game. But he turned to me and said, I want a worthy opponent, which I thought was just delightful and also very helpful. It was feedback received. Gina, get it together. We got to practice, So anyway, it's important what these things look like. And again, we reinforce both precursors and problem behavior in the analysis. I'm going to be really quick here. Analysis data. Clear differentiation, no problem behavior and control conditions. And even within test sessions, we wanted to see that problem behavior only occurred when we withdrew aspects of the reinforcement context and not when it was present. We don't want to see carryover. I'm going to be super quick on procedures. Critical features of SBT are that reinforcement is intermittent. So, you kind of fade into this process where you're reinforcing a lot of different skills, but once you are, you got to keep reinforcing that FCR, that man, some of the time. Got to reinforce the okay some of the time and require cooperation some of the time if you really want to maintain each skill. Also, the magnitude of reinforcement should be unpredictable. Shouldn't always be 30 seconds. It's definitely not long enough. Sometimes it should be longer. Sometimes it should be very brief. And that, as Greg says, keeps hope alive. And helps kids develop a robustness toward real world conditions where sometimes fun time gets cut short unexpectedly. And reinforcement is synthesized. And we call it child-led time EO presentation, where we're withdrawing either some or all of synthesized reinforcement. We call it adult-led time. And those two things alternate contingent on the alternative behavior we've decided to reinforce, the 3 that are listed here, 3 general classes. We use a shaping process for functional communication training. I cannot believe how short I am on time, so I'm just going to be super quick. But there's one really important thing about this. We start with a really simple low effort response for several reasons. One, we want the kid to come into contact with reinforcement quickly. We want to know that problem behavior is, it's going to compete effectively with problem behavior right at the outset. But also, it's my belief, and we're doing some smart tech research also, and I say I collaborate a little bit with folks at Vanderbilt Kennedy Center Triad, but where we're measuring physiological responses in the context of ISCA and skill-based treatment. And I think that there is physiological reactivity to EO presentation. There's a threat of work, and I don't know whether that's the outcome of respondent conditioning or transformation of stimulus function through language, but for some reason there is something that's more reflexive going on. And by starting with a low effort FCR, I think we're facilitating some form of respondent extinction. And that's what we might characterize as building trust, is like, we're here and we're only gradually increasing response effort as your physiological reflexive responses to EO presentations start to diminish in this context. Again, just a hypothesis, but I'm like really interested in pursuing that if at all possible. Who knows? I'm a clinical professor. I don't have as much time for research as I'd like, but if anybody else is thinking of what they want to start working on, that I don't know, that could be helpful. So we gradually increase the response effort. We reinforce, a series of approximations toward a terminal FCR, which has a couple components: the attention getter, the demand itself, and the form of that varies across kids. And then we add some body language requirements. What's going to make an adult want to give you what you want? And the kids can usually identify what that is. Well, I should look at them at least once. We don't require eye contact, but it's like, make sure they're paying attention to you. And they're going to appreciate that too. Maybe set your toys aside. Use a polite vocal tone. Here's what that looks like. So we make sure it's really nice and socially valid. And then finally, and I note that this is not necessarily consistent with what other folks are doing with SBT right now, but for us, the last stage of FCT, this is how the process worked years ago. And for us, we've tried it another way and regretted it and gone back to it. But before we say you've mastered the FCR and we're going to start denying it, we vary the EO like crazy. We say anything we can that might evoke problem behavior from the kid to just confirm that the first resort is communication, verbal communication in its many forms. It could be a card exchange versus problem behavior. And we tell the kids, we're like, okay, we're going to start trying to trick you. We're going to say some crazy stuff like you got to go to ISS in school suspension. We might just take your stuff. And then again, we're working through some possibly reflexive behavior that comes along for the ride. Because if somebody grabs something I'm holding, my instinct is to wrench it away. And things happen inside my body too. And so we want to make sure that instead of those instincts, we start really establishing a strong tendency toward ask right away. All right, enough said about that. We proceeded to tolerance response training. Again, some of the time we say no and reinforce an acceptance, and then demand fading. Just to help you picture that process, we might start off with one easy demand. Maybe then there are going to be 3 easy demands that have to be cooperated with for child access reinforcement. Then we start incorporating some chains of harder demands. So a session might look something like this, most of the way through that demand fading or CAB chaining process. Contextually appropriate behavior chaining is another term you'll see. So in one trial, the terminal requirement might be cooperation with 10 hard demands. In another, it might be 13 easy demands. In another, it's just asking, can I have my way, please? In another, it's saying okay when denied after asking. And then another, it's a chain of hard demands again, but not as many. So we want the response requirements to be unpredictable as well, just to build robustness to what's coming in the natural environment and what's going on in the natural environment currently. Now, enhanced choice model is applied across all of this. I overviewed these things earlier. I'll give you a couple more details. In Hangout, I say non-contingent reinforcement, but it is not matched to the synthesized reinforcement context that we are using in the practice that the child is participating in with us. So we actually let them have all their tangible items and activities, and we stop presenting any demands, but we downgrade the quality of our attention a little bit. We're like, we're not going to play with you, but we're here and we'll talk if you need it. And that's simply, I hope that one day that non-contingent reinforcement can be exactly the same as what it is in practice. There is evidence that humans prefer contingency. Holly Gover published a cool lit review on that, if you're interested. But until like somebody's demonstrated that in intervention work or I test it systematically, I'm not ready to do that. I'm still stacking the deck toward practice a little bit. That said, Hangout absolutely needs to be awesome enough to compete with problem behavior. So don't let Hangout be not cool, or you're just going to get problem behavior instead of Hangout. And then they're not practicing the skill of discriminating that they need a break and taking it. So yes, just important stuff that doesn't always come through in print in a journal article. This is my chance to say it to you. They can command vocally for Hangout. They can walk into the area, like I said earlier. Also, it's just a contingency. So it doesn't need to be a physical location. In fact, for one client for whom moving her body was the most evocative demand you could present, we simply gave her a card that was green on one side and, I don't know if I forget, pink or blue on the other. And one side was Hangout and one side was practice. So she could stay right where she was and just shut us down with our requirements for her to get up and do, physical activity and other work. So it's just a change of contingency. So just think of it in that sense rather than there has to be a designated physical area in the classroom. These things are just, it's a concurrent operant arrangement that can look a lot of different ways. I'm not going to talk through this figure. I was going to, but it's too complicated. Gosh, you have access to these slides. I'm going to just stay on this slide and give you a couple summary points. Actually, I have a summary slide that I will go to just so I have some time to show you data before we conclude. I'm really bad at, always have way more information than I can possibly share. One day I will learn to plan in a way that actually fits the time constraints. But we talk with our clients a ton. And regardless of your client's language abilities, you should talk with your clients a ton. One, we never really know. I constantly underestimate my own young children's receptive language abilities. They understand so much more than I realize. And then they'll do something that makes it really clear. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I should be using language more. And the same is true of our clients who have a variety of disabilities and language skills. And then with my clients with EBD, of course, they're quite language abled and they're often able to participate in conversations. We want their input on procedures and goals to the extent they're able to share it. And then we want to use that input, and that gives them shared governance in treatment planning. So when they give us feedback, for example, our most recent client told us he was scared when we had one of my male graduate students implementing procedures, and that he didn't like it. And we were like, hey, cool, thanks for telling us that. How about let's have a goal of you learning to work with a male teacher, because you're going to have that in life. But for right now, let's put that on the back burner. We're going to honor that and just have the female students responsible for implementation for a while. And I think honoring feedback in that way, whenever we can, is really important for the client experience and supports their autonomy. We also verbally describe all contingencies and changes. And so this is something I think should be done with all clients. This doesn't require the client to express anything, but they might understand more than we think. And even if they don't, we can help develop their language skills by matching language to what they're experiencing. So good contingency reviews can facilitate language acquisition and facilitate acquisition of rule-governed behavior and the ability of clients to kind of discriminate which rules are worth following. If we include in that review, why this is good for you in life, not just because I'm controlling your access to fun times right now. So if you're familiar with the Bayesian rule-governed behavior stuff, I'm talking about tracking over clients. And I think that's how we as behavior analysts are really going to be able to start to take steps toward resolving this issue of compliance training and what comes along with that versus really teaching people to take ownership and have autonomy in their own lives. We try to, along with that, tell clients why we're teaching these things that connects to those long-term outcomes. And we want to celebrate victories with them. They know it when they've mastered a skill and they're leveling up. We kind of gamify the whole thing when we can. So I cannot, 6 minutes left. I'm not going to give you any experimental design. Suffice it to say, everybody has a monster single case graph. and we're going to look in aggregate very quickly, just at trials to mastery per phase. The outcomes, what were the means on important dependent variables, problem behavior, precursor behavior, skills in each phase, and how they spent their time, given that they had all these choices to participate or not. Trials to mastery varied by participant. I think the big takeaway here is that it's not that one phase of this treatment is the hardest. It depends on the client. And that's just important to know. I kind of expected to see demand fading as as where it took the most trials to mastery across most kids. And that does show up for a lot of them, but for some of them, it's complex FCT. It's tolerating that varied EO presentation. It's, getting all those words out. It's that respondent extinction process that I think is occurring along the way because they haven't mastered it till we see it without any problem behavior coming along with it or signs of escalation. So just know I don't know yet that we have the data to predict who's going to need more support in what phase. That was just another look at the same data, again, not showing that any one phase is the most difficult. Outcomes on important dependent variables in baseline, this is dangerous problem behavior. There was virtually none. Baseline is functional analysis test sessions, ISCA test sessions. So there were for 2 clients. Everybody else, we kept a lid on it by reinforcing precursors. And then we don't see dangerous problem behavior throughout treatment. That's it, probably because of the embedded alternatives in an enhanced choice model, hang out and leave instead of problem behavior. We don't know that for sure, haven't tested it directly. Some problem behavior during staff implementation. Precursors, of course, showed up quite a bit. That's what we're reinforcing in functional analyses, but drop out and functional communication training, see virtually none. They do start to crop up in demand fading. Rubber hits the road when the kids have to start doing that hard work that they got referred for engaging in problem behavior to avoid among accessing other reinforcers. SI is staff implementation. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. So we see some precursor behavior when staff implemented procedures, naturally occurring staff. Rates of functional communicative responses, none at baseline, decreasing across phases. That's because sessions get longer as kids tolerate EO for longer. So that's not a bad trend. It shows that it's stable, but we're decreasing the percentage of time that's the response, the terminal response in the chain. Same thing for tolerance response. And then for cooperation, we see variable but low levels in phases until demand fading when we start reinforcing it, and everybody jumps up to pretty high percentages of cooperation. To look at that in terms of academic engagement in our last 2.5 minutes here, this is the highest number of instances of cooperation in a session by participant or application. So this ranged for Kendrick, the most he tackled at once was about 25, but for Peter, it was 70. Now, Peter, Carlos, Bernard, the ones with really high numbers of instances of cooperation, we're engaging with precision teaching and direct instruction where there's a really high rate of opportunities to respond. Kids like Daryl, who actually is academically gifted, was working on like problem solving and logical thinking. So it might take much longer to complete one or demonstrate one instance of cooperation. So just take that with a grain of salt. And here it is mapped against percentage. So they were working hard. All right, time in EO varied. So that's like how much time did they tolerate of work? We have a long way to go on this. For some of these kids, particularly Kendrick, Denise, that doesn't look, 5 minutes is not what we need kids to do to really be able to make progress in schools. So more work to do in that area, but some kids, of course, were working for significantly longer periods of time. Finally, ECM allocation. The black portion of the bar is practice. Y-axis is percent of total session time. Gray is hangout. White is leave. So across all 9 applications, we didn't throw any participants out. This is everybody we've done this with at this school, done it in the same way with. They strongly prefer practice, which is pretty awesome. So we can do these things that are pretty great alternatives. And we have the fear that then kids are just going to hang out and not learn anything, but they don't. They choose to learn. And that's awesome because I want them to be a part of their treatment planning process. Where are these kids now? Dante moved. I don't know where he is, unfortunately. These students highlighted in a darker purple are still receiving services in the same placement, though they've reportedly made progress on social, behavioral, and academic targets. These 3 students, or 4, made a transition to a different school, a less restrictive setting by the start of the school year after they concluded treatment. Can't say this is why they transitioned, but that's remarkable, especially because very few students transition out of this particular type of school setting, self-contained setting, and stay in their new placement. And they've been there for a couple of years. Cool stuff. I'm not going to talk to you about staff training. But as I flip through these slides to my conclusion, know that we have ongoing staff training studies. We're learning that if people have had training on the rationale for procedures before the nitty-gritty of procedures, they respond better. That makes sense. I think when we train people on why and what, they're more able to make decisions in the moment. They don't just have to memorize a checklist. So to conclude, we know some things about ECM. It's safe, and it does result in the outcomes we look for, at least from an efficacy standpoint in a controlled setting. We need to do more work on generalization. We can use enhanced choice as a means for ongoing way monitoring students' preference for treatment. If they're not choosing to practice, we should be making changes to our treatment training procedures. That's what that should tell us. But broadly, students preferred treatment so far. And what we're doing ultimately is allowing them to assent every second of the time to participation in our treatment procedures. And that, I think that probably always should have been important. I'm much more aware of the importance of that now in our current climate. And I'm so thankful for the disability advocacy that's out there that is nowadays that is helping me understand the client perspective a little better. All right, can I take one last minute to finish with some values? Thank you, Thanos. So I think some things that come through here that can help us guide our thinking with all treatment procedures are a goal of interdependence for our clients. We want to teach trust and cooperation over compliance. Or if you're familiar with the Hayes stuff, tracking over compliance. Allowing students an out at any time and reinforcing several alternatives to problem behavior helps students discriminate when they are stressed and need a break, and also take an appropriate and safe action to do it. And that interdependence is also supported by us allowing those things and teaching those things and having those feedback conversations and coaching with students and helping them see why we're doing this and helping them influence their treatment plan. That leads to self-advocacy. The more we solicit input from them and then reinforce their sharing it by honoring it, the more likely students are to volunteer their experiences to others. And we need them to do that for us to understand their experience. Finally, I talk a ton about this, but joy. A child should know joy in every day, Nicholas Hobbs, the re-education model. And that joy can be found, I think we all feel best when there's a balance between cooperating with someone else's agenda at work, at school, and having things our way. And we appreciate having things our way more when we've earned it. I hope you guys have a nice glass of wine or something after this because you've done some work this evening. But that I think is a nice example. So I hope this was clear. I'm sorry that my timing was poor. I'd be happy to take questions via email or if I'm allowed to stay on and anyone wants to. But please feel free to reach out. And I really appreciate this time with y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Staubitz. I don't think that the time issue was a problem. We hear you loud and clear, and I'm sure we all enjoyed the points you made. Just to say that the last keyword is choice. The last keyword is choice, as we say, the enhanced choice model. If you've got questions, I'm more than happy to read them out to Joy. I have sent in the chat my email. You're going to email me the 3 keywords with your name as you want it on the certificate and your BCBA certification number. And please keep in mind, we've got 40 days to issue them. So don't worry if it takes a while for us to get back to you with your certificates. This will also be uploaded on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and revisit it. And I will send the slides along with your certificates. Joy will share the slides and I will send these to you guys along with your certificates. Have I got any questions? Oh, I've got a few. Okay, I have been using the SBT for several years and planning to replicate it for my dissertation. So got very excited about your presentation today. And of course, I have 100 questions. Okay, the first one is, could I ask why there is a variation of reinforced duration in your study, 30 to 90 seconds? Did it vary between kids or was it used as differential reinforcement?
Yes, that we did across all applications. So we always varied reinforcement from 30 to 90 seconds across trials just to keep it unpredictable. Sometimes, like, it's almost like we want to teach that it's that you never know when you're going to get a big one. So it's worth it to keep plugging away. And even if it's not this time, you're going to get a longer time in reinforcement later. That also doing that, we've done some supplementary analyses. Like, I remember for one of those participants, Carlos, we ended up hypothesizing like, are we getting more resistance in our cooperation trials when they've followed a short reinforcement interval, like a 30 or 45 seconds versus 90. And so then we did a little alternating treatments design to test that hypothesis, where for a session, we used only briefer. We ranged between like 30 and 60 seconds, and then we ranged between 90 and 120 seconds in another session, and kind of just kept alternating, and found that it made no difference, which doesn't mean it wouldn't make a difference for any client. But all that goes to say is, like, doing that can also give you another lever to manipulate if you're like, what can we adjust to try to clean this up a little bit? But mostly that's about keeping things unpredictable to keep hope alive. It's intermittent. It kind of functions the same way intermittent reinforcement might. It's an unpredictable magnitude versus a different parameter, but can facilitate generalization or persistence of responding in other contexts.
The second question says, you also state that compliance was scored unless a child engaged in 10 seconds or more of behavior that was incompatible with the task. May I ask for an example what that would have been or looked like?
Yes. So how did I say it again? Just read the part that's the direct quote for me. Make sure I'm.
Sorry, could you say it again? Sorry, you broke up.
Can you read the part that's the direct quote about 10 seconds to make sure I remember exactly what the procedure was?
So compliance was scored unless a child engaged in 10 seconds or more of behavior that was incompatible with the task.
Yes. So we had to kind of have a rule for, like, at what point do we judge that this child is no longer cooperating? So you know how, it's pretty hard to define engagement in something like that requires thinking. So if a child is working on like a multi-step math problem, they might sit back for a second and then keep writing. And we didn't want to offset our count of cooperation based on that brief pause, because that child may or may not have still been engaged in the task. And so we had that 10-second criteria. I think I cannot precisely remember that 10-second offset rule. If they stop working for more than 10 seconds, we're not going to call that an instance of cooperation unless they completed, like if I present like, hey, tell me 3 plus 3, and then at second 8, they say 6. And I don't present another, like, so it kind of is dependent on when a demand is presented. If they cooperate sometime before 10 seconds elapses, we count it. But if 10 seconds goes by without elapsing, that's kind of our cutoff. We say, okay, that one didn't count. I hope that helps. Also, along with that, we weren't scoring based on accuracy because we couldn't judge effort. We're kind of just scoring based on, are they cooperating by producing an answer that is like reasonably related to the stimulus we presented. Yeah, so the 10 seconds is really just about judging when is long enough that we've given them an opportunity to initiate.
Third question, have you had any spontaneous CFCR communication mid-task, or was this not necessary as the kids could leave or hang out at any time?
Great question. Rarely. I don't want to say never, but I can't remember a time that happened. We do occasionally have spontaneous CFCRs in the middle of child-led time, which means we need to look at what we just did, and because that's an EO, and that's not what we want to program during child-led time. Yeah, I guess through the process, our learners understand that it really is the chain, and we're going to be the ones to tell them when the work is done. So we don't see a lot of that. Although I would say if we did, we would absolutely remind them that hangout is an option. And we would prompt, when we saw problem behavior, I can't tell you the exact rules, and I hope they're clear in the paper, but we would provide reminders of hangout kind of non-contingently, like in case they forget there's an alternative, like this is, remember, you can go over there and we're going to stop telling you to do this stuff. So those prompts are very important.
Fourth question. How could the children signal that they wanted to just hang out or leave?
They could either just go and do it, which we would absolutely respect. So we didn't score elopement as a problem behavior because, it would be defined the same way as leave. they could just walk out and we'd follow them out and make sure they got safely to their classroom, or just walking to hang out, or they could tell us, I'm going to go back to class. And the benefit to them telling us that is that we don't have to wait for them to reach the boundary of that physical location before changing the contingencies in place. And so most students picked up on that. You know, there was this Kendrick, one of the participants, they're all pseudonyms, I hope that goes without saying. It was so funny. So one of his challenging scenarios was someone telling him to leave the play area. And so the demand that had been presented in EO presentation was like, I need you to come over here. And he wanted to go to hang out. Oh no, the demand was stand up. He wanted to go to hang out, but he would have had to stand up to go to hang out. So we don't want that. We want it to not be a problem, but there's some counter control. He's like, I don't want to do the thing you told me to do. He rolled onto the bottom of a rolling cart and rolled himself into hangout. And we just celebrated that. So that's how flexible we are. And that's how much we want students to actually hang out because otherwise it's worse for all of us. But it was amazing. It was great.
Fifth question. I've got many, Joy. Has anybody tried the enhanced choice model yet with kids that are less verbally able? I have a 14-year-old who has limited vocal verbal abilities with whom we have tried to implement it, and it works well so far.
Oh, that's so awesome to hear. I was just going to say, the only examples I've heard are from practitioners, and we really need research in that area. So you are one more data point here. My husband's behavior analyst and works for Triad at Vanderbilt Medical Center, and they do some of that too. And I would love to sit in a room and hear you all discuss how you teach the procedures. I imagine there's a lot of modeling, role play, and direct, like facilitated contact with each alternative. But I don't see why that wouldn't work. And really, enhanced choice is just an extension of like what we understand about implementing concurrent operant schedules. And so when we think about it that way, I mean, those originated in the operant laboratory with rats and pigeons. So of course, learners who are less language abled are capable of discriminating contingencies that aren't verbally described and allocating responding accordingly. So I know it can be done. It's so exciting to hear that you have done it. And I know a couple other folks who've done that in support of educators and their students. Yes. And I think starting in January, there is a research project being started that will shed further light on that initiative.
Can people email you? We've got a question about your graphs that people love. And we've got a question about the computer-based training for implementers. Is that okay if people email you about their questions?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I threw this up here because I thought I was going to have told you a little bit about it, but yeah, feel free. Yes, email me about that. I can send a flyer. I hope it's not like shameless recruitment. We've met our recruitment goals, so don't feel like I'm pushing you or trying to manipulate you, but we are going to leave it open for a while just because the social validity has been very high. And if more people want to participate, that will help us learn more about the characteristics of adults that predict their response to different variations on the treatment package. So currently we're doing a component analysis. We're using multiple exemplar training, a couple other forms of practice that are sort of, when you do computer-based training, you can't do the really important parts of BST that are like practicing the skill and getting feedback because nobody can observe you implementing it and give you feedback on it. So we have all these other practice things that are like substitutes for that. And so the more people enroll, the better a job we can do at saying like, a BCBA who has training in this area only needs, this form of practice, whereas an educator who's never implemented a functional communication training procedure needs this full package. So anyway, we'd love to have you, but no pressure. I hope I didn't take advantage of anything by throwing that up there.
People are saying that this was a wonderful complimentary presentation for those of whom have completed the 10-hour SBT training. So thank you for that, Joey. I've got a question that says, have you had any experience using this approach with children that escalate very quickly and have multiple and changeable antecedents to behavior that are difficult to identify?
Oh, gosh.
And
yes,
then cause a lot of distraction, and it is very hard to turn off the behavior. I'm trying to see whether I should read the whole thing. It's quite long.
Go for it.
So again, children that escalate very quickly, multiple changeable antecedents, behaviors that are, and it's difficult to identify those antecedents. As a result, we've got a lot of distraction and it's very hard to turn off the behavior. They then cause distraction and meet behaviors that challenge and access to anything offered, including escape, is not usually successful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love this question. I think that the use of synthesized contingencies in functional analysis and function-based intervention really came about, or like has emerged specifically to solve some of those very problems. So by synthesizing, we're looking at an EO that is most motivating, like creates the highest value for reinforcement. And remember, those are two sides of one coin. If reinforcement includes high quality attention, access to certain items and activities that the adult, it participates in a certain way with, and also no demands, including like some implicit demands and play, whatever, we figure that out. Remember that the EO is the opposite of that. And so the more we wrap into reinforcement, the higher the value is when we take that thing away. And what that does for us with these kind of slow burn clients for whom it's hard to figure it out is we take all the things that happen along the way that escalate them, and we try to find a way to put them together so that they have a faster impact. So we're really, like with the ISCA, we're not trying to model what happens in the natural environment when problem behavior occurs. We're trying to create a contrive a situation in which we can reliably and quickly get problem behavior, because that means we can reliably and quickly get an alternative, like a functional communicative response. So I think for that profile that you're describing, those are the hardest kids to work with in some ways, but those are the kids for whom it's most important to look at all those different triggers. And instead of looking at them as isolated things, sometimes it's this does it, the transition to literacy centers evokes a tantrum. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's, the peer getting called on and not him, but other times he's fine. We might want to put all that together at once to be maximally evocative so that we can predictably get the client in a state where they're ready to learn, so to speak. And that also highlights the importance of identifying and catching the earliest signs of escalation, because the other part of this question and answer is that when there is a slow burn, and you guys who've done the 10-hour workshop have heard this in great depth, but we get emotional responding. And once there is emotional responding, behavior isn't as sensitive to our manipulations of the environment. You said, like, even withdrawing the work demands won't shut it off at that point. Providing all their stuff won't shut it off. And that's because they're kind of past the peak of the escalation cycle. If you guys are interested, there's an IRIS module. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a center out of Vanderbilt, actually, but it's used a lot worldwide. And there are a couple modules on the escalation cycle that get at this idea where at a certain point, if a child's at peak and there's emotion, you gotta kind of ride it out. And there are things you can do as you write it out that are going to facilitate it de-escalating, and things that are going to ratchet it back up, and you're still not going to be able to turn it off. So that might be worth looking at. But all that to say, it's super important we look for precursors and reinforce them immediately, because for those kids who escalate quickly, that opportunity, that window is very short, and the cost is high if we miss it. So we've got to reinforce that precursor or prompt before, at the time, that precursor, if we're in treatment, so that we don't get that emotional responding that then makes it impossible for us to do anything but wait out the de-escalation. I hope that makes sense. It's really hard, and I think it's like, it can sound simple as we talk about these things, and they're logical, and sometimes we hear them, we're like, yeah, got it. Oh, of course. But in practice, I just want to validate that it's not that simple. And even, across many clients, more than the 9 whose data I shared today, I'm still running into clients who are giving me a run for my money, and we're still working through things. It's not resolved, so it's work in progress. But I do think the ISCA and SBT, for those particular reasons, the strength of the EO and the inclusion of precursors in a functional class that we're targeting, are a perfect fit for that situation where a kid escalates quickly. It's hard to understand why, and it's hard to de-escalate.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Joy. I think these are all the questions answered. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to come back after the New Year's. Keep an eye out for the flyer and all the posts that we send around for the next journal club. Joy, thank you ever so much for joining us, and hopefully we're going to have you again to talk more about your wonderful research and the lovely work you guys do at Vanderbilt.
You all are so kind to have me, and your questions were amazing, and this has just been such a delight. Feel free to reach out. Thanks.
Okay. Have a great Christmas.